5. The Alamo Ranch falls into debt, and Richard appeals to Talbot Hyde for a loan. Richard's winter trip into the remote wilderness of Chaco Canyon. Discovery of Kiet Siel. Through the spring and early summer, 1894, Richard again gave most of his attention to the ranch. In May, a letter came from Talbot Hyde saying that he and Fred would like to see the country where Richard had worked in the previous winter. Richard invited them to come out and to make Alamo Ranch their home during the stay. He promised them they might also enjoy some hunting in the mountains and recommended the trout to be found in the mountain streams. When the Hydes arrived 2 weeks later, they were prepared to spend the rest of June at the ranch. At the end of the month, Richard began outfitting for their trip, and on the 5th of July, with Clayton accompanying them, they started for Bluff City and Grand Gulch. A number of years afterwards, Talbot recalled their experiences by a slip of memory, referring to the time as the summer of 1895. By doing a bit of excavating ourselves, he said, we learned something of the great difficulties encountered upon turning over the cave floors, often covered with a layer of bat droppings, or more likely turkey droppings, and an impalpable dust, the deposit of the centuries. We took many photographs. After resting at Bluff City, we followed up Cottonwood Canyon, then heading to the canyons and washes in the west, struck out directly for Elk Mountain, and made the Bear's Ears. It took all of one day to break trail up Elk Mountain, and we made camp near an excellent spring for 4 days, where our burros mixed with a bunch of wild colts and were not so easily found. After visiting the caves and cliff houses, we returned to Bluff and retraced our way to Mancos. When he and Fred returned east, Talbot added, they took with them the negatives, maps, and all the records Richard had made during the winter expedition. Richard's field notes survive, but the maps and negatives have not been found. This material may have been turned over a few years afterwards to George H. Pepper, and then on to the staff of the American Museum of Natural History, since the only early photographic prints of the 1893-94 expedition known to exist are in the collection now owned by Pepper's daughter, Mrs. James Cameron. No data relating to the Hyde exploring expedition has been preserved or can be accounted for by the widows of the Hyde brothers. Once more at Mancos at the end of July, they found that Julie and Bert Cowing had arrived at the Alamo Ranch for the summer, and other guests were expected. Meanwhile, there was a little flurry of excitement when Clayton was kicked in the chest and sent sprawling by a burro that resented Clayton's efforts to throw a pack over his back. The wind was knocked out of him, but no bones were broken. Short time afterwards, Richard was kicked in the face while breaking a red-eyed bronco. After making sure his nose was still where it ought to be, bent but not shattered, Richard went on bronco breaking with nothing worse than a split lip. A distinguished gentleman from Ohio was among the visitors at the ranch that summer. Judge Charles Candy Baldwin of Cleveland, a presiding judge of the Ohio Circuit Court, had first come to Mancos the year before and was now back with his brother to enjoy the Wetherill's hospitality. Judge Baldwin had lively interest in the cliff dwellings and contributed a small amount of money to add to the funds supplied by Talbot Hyde and a man named McNeely for the excavation of the painted Kevon Snyder's Ranch in Montezuma Valley. Although Baldwin was considerably older than Richard, a firm friendship developed between them, Bert Cowing once hearing the judge speak of Richard as a king among men. Talbot and Fred Hyde were also at the ranch at this time, and may have been members of the party when Richard took Judge Baldwin and his brother into the Mesa to explore and photograph the cliff dwellings. In any case, the Hydes left shortly thereafter, on August 8th, for New York. They were impressed with the Grand Gulch collection and let Richard understand that his first expedition was merely the beginning of their association. Nevertheless, when they left Mancos, no definite plan had been agreed upon for the coming winter, when Richard could best afford to be away. By the middle of October, Richard realized the ranch was in serious trouble. He wrote to Talbot Hyde on the 16th, explaining how the summer's dry spell had ruined nearly all the crops, leaving only enough wheat for feed, flour for the family's needs, and seed for the next year. He added that misfortune has put me in such shape that I will have to borrow $6,000. Would Talbot help him, providing Richard offered sufficient security? If I get it for 6% per annum, giving 640 acres of land and improvements as security, we can make it in one good crop, but I would require 5 years' time to pay it easily. I have not yet made an application for a loan, but if you have any funds to invest in that way, you may do so. As you know, it is gilt-edged security. And from this, Richard went on to discuss the discussion of other matters, so as not to seem to press too hard in his appeal. Hyde replied that he did not have the money to spare. It's uncertain just how or from whom Richard finally succeeded in raising the loan, but from this point on, the Alamo Ranch was operated under crushing debt. And for the next 4 years, until he turned his back on Mancos and left the ranch in Al Wetherill's care, Richard was oppressed with constant worry. Once the discouraging fall harvest was in and other duties attended to, Richard's thoughts dwelt on that winter and finding another collection for the Hydes. He held his own counsel, not writing again to Talbot Hyde until the following June, but a week or so after Hyde had declined his appeal, he began outfitting for another trip. This time he had no positive objective, but to explore new country. Unfortunately, since this winter found him doing some of his most interesting work, Richard either made no field notes or they've been lost. Only an incomplete, undetailed record exists to show that in November he was looking for ruins in New Mexico, perhaps among the Animas and the San Juan. It's uncertain whether he was alone or had companions with him. But in December he was heading north again into Utah, where he saw the year out in a lonely wilderness of mesas and deep canyons. Apparently found nothing there to hold him long, for once again he turned south. One chilly day in January 1895, Richard, now accompanied by his brother Al and Charlie Mason, crossed the San Juan below Bluff City and entered the slag heap wasteland which offers the only northern approach into the unearthly beauty of Monument Valley. For the next 4 months, the men lived on whatever game they could shoot or food they could obtain in barter at some isolated hogan. From here south to Marsh Pass and beyond, there were no trading posts, no white men. They met only drifting bands of sheep and occasionally a few Indians. It was country, trackless and uncharted, filled with danger for 3 white men traveling with desirable horses and burros. In the deepest recesses of Tsegi's 3 main canyons, noisy jays lorded over the smaller birds, their scolding cries shattering an otherwise profound silence. During the warmer time of the year, there's an added hum of honeybees thrusting into the purple blossoms of the bee plant, which grows here in profusion, or hovering in the patches of wild roses among the scrub oak against the canyon walls. At night, the thin, steady trill of crickets threads the stillness, but in March the only sounds are those of the jays and the rustle of running water. Small springs bubble up in cold, clear water at the head of each canyon. The streams thus formed gradually widen and become cloudy with sand as they flow on a twisting, shallow course downward to where the three forks of the Tsegi open into one broad canyon 600 feet deep. Here, the streams converge into one, becoming Laguna Creek, which flows eastward along the floor of the sandstone chasm to the mouth of the Tsegi at Marsh Pass. At this point, the stream abruptly turns off into a northerly direction until it eventually joins up with Shinle Wash. Marsh Pass is a narrow gap, about a half-mile long, between Mesa de la Vaca on the east and a nameless tilting shelf of pink sandstone on the west, which rises to high tableland thickly carpeted with dark green juniper and pinon. Skeleton Mesa and Aglatha Needle lie roughly to the north, the wide Chinle Valley off to the east. Below the pass, opening gently, is the Cletha Valley, descending steadily for some 50 miles to Moncapi Wash and the westernmost of the Hopi villages. Several miles north and south of Marsh Pass, there are found high on the western side a number of small cliff dwellings, and scattered out below them against the edge of the valley the ruins of small pueblos abandoned by the Anasazi more than 600 years ago. Since then, the Navajos have claimed the valley as exclusively theirs. This makes the Navajos practically newcomers because the first known inhabitants, the basket makers, moved in nearly 2,000 years ago. From that time forward, the region has been occupied more or less continuously. It was here in Marsh Pass that Richard, Al Wetherill, and Charlie Mason worked during the first 2 months of 1895, probing through the high caves and pueblo sites until at last they turned up Laguna Creek and followed its winding course into Tsegi Canyon. Their progress was leisurely, as they halted often to work the small surface ruins, which were scarcely more than mounds of sand and rubble, littered with thousands of fragments of pottery. When they came finally to the great opening of the Tsegi, where the canyon spread out like fingers from the palm of the hand, Richard chose to turn off to the right and follow the center branch to its head. Had they continued straight onward another mile or two into one of the smaller gorges, they would have discovered the immense cave and shadowy ruin of Vedatakan, which was found 14 years later by John Wetherill and Byron Cummings. Their choice made, they proceeded first across the broad sand flat and then between the deep zigzagging banks of an arroyo, riding single file and crossing and recrossing the shallow stream. Above the arroyo, perpendicular cliffs of red sandstone closed in on them from either side, blotting out all but a band of the March sky. They had not traveled far when the sides of the arroyo widened out and then dropped off into a narrow little valley, perhaps several hundred yards long. In the center of this was a pond, fed at the north end by a waterfall spilling over a stone ledge from a higher level of the canyon floor. This was the first of 5 such waterfalls and lagoons Richard later said he and the others found loosely linked over a distance not more than 8 miles. On one or more of the lagoons they saw wild ducks floating among the reeds and tall grasses. Following the stream bed at a constantly rising, twisting course, the men were conscious always of the red cliffs towering to the left and right of them, but opening now to a wider stretch of sky. They emerged finally onto a high grassy plain, perhaps a quarter of a mile across and sheltered along its borders by clumps of pin oak. A few giant Douglas firs grew up in niches of the cliffs above the canyon floor. Up to this point, they'd failed to detect the faintest trace of human life, but now, just around the shallow bend of the west cliff and 100 feet above them, was the high arc of a cave, not deep but long, overhanging the rubble of a tumbled Anasazi dwelling. The cave's arch was as lofty as a cathedral spire. The prehistoric dwelling it sheltered, a humble abode.
And I feel like New York City. Get me to the farm. Get me